Now, one of the most common friendly Star Wars debates that I tend to have or get into is about just how well known were the Jedi across the galaxy at different points in time, with me always arguing that after 1,000 generations, which is roughly 25,000 years, that their legacy had permeated to most corners of the galaxy, or at least corners of the Republic that they had been the protectors of for all that time, keeping in mind the Republic does not span the whole galaxy. And I'm by no means arguing that absolutely everyone, or even close to everyone in the Republic, would have heard of them, much less seen one in person, or even believe their stories, believe the things that they can do. But if you live on, shall we say, your average planet in the Republic, one that's more modern and connected, if you will, you've likely heard the name Jedi before, if not been taught all about them in school. You likely even heard them mentioned in the Holo news, or even have seen a Holo drama or Holo movie about them. I'd imagine they're the subject of many, many fictional stories within the Star Wars galaxy, and we do hear that mentioned in several stories in the Star Wars galaxy. However, there are still many people who will argue that, no, the Jedi aren't anywhere near that well known, that actually very few beings across the galaxy, or across the Republic, have ever heard of them despite how long they have existed and how intertwined with the history of the galaxy and Republic they are. And despite the fact that Lucasfilm in the High Republic era is making them feel like, at least at this time a couple hundred years before the prequels, like pretty much everyone knew about the Jedi across the galaxy. I mean, as someone who's been reading all the books and comics released in the High Republic era, I can't think of a single example off the top of my head of a character who didn't know all about the Jedi. I'm not saying there hasn't been any, but it's implied the galaxy or the Republic, on the whole, knows all about the Jedi. Heck, the Jedi are even leading the expansion into the Outer Rim at this time. They even constructed a literal beacon of hope in space that is a constant reminder to the galaxy that they're out there watching and protecting them. Another common argument against the popularity of the Jedi that I see is that after the Clone Wars, the Empire does all they can to essentially erase their memory from the galaxy, which we have heard is the case in many places across the canon. It also makes perfect sense that they'd want to do away with their memory and that it would be effective to at least some degree to make it almost illegal to even mention the Jedi, though probably only more so with anyone born after the Clone Wars and who couldn't remember the war itself. Because anyone who did live through the war would likely remember or have heard at some point that the Jedi were the generals of the Republic, probably seen and heard them mentioned in the Holo news all the time, even if they weren't trying to pay attention to the Holo news. Sometimes it's difficult to avoid the news of the day, if you will. You'd probably especially have heard about them if you were on the side of the Separatist. I'd imagine there was all kinds of propaganda released against the Jedi during the war about how they are the lapdogs of the Republic or they're trained soldiers, whatever it might be. Not to mention Palpatine in his address to the galaxy, the one that said the Republic would be reorganized into an empire, he essentially said the Jedi were the reason to blame for all of it, and I would imagine history would record his words that it would be one of the most famous speeches in the history of the galaxy. Then there's also this rather interesting scene in the Kenobi series, the one where an Inquisitor shuttle lands in the middle of a town, followed by them walking menacingly down Main Street for all to see, and then entering a bar or a cantina, and the Grand Inquisitor saying this.
You know who we are.
Inquisitors.
You know what we do?
You hunt Jedi.
They, the Inquisitors, then go on to cause a huge scene over people potentially aiding and abetting Jedi, even cutting off a woman's hand in the process, and finally, they even hang a Jedi in what is essentially the town square, warning no one to help them ever again. Which all greatly conflicts with both arguments against the Jedi being popular. Clearly, the Inquisitors expected pretty much everyone here 10 years after the Clone Wars to know who the Jedi were still, and to know who they were, that they hunt Jedi. Also, all in all, this wasn't helping or making anyone forget about the Jedi. I dare say that's an incident most people who lived through it would remember and talk about for quite some time. And what's really going on here in this scene in Kenobi, why Lucasfilm seems to have some trouble keeping things straight when it comes to how well known the Jedi were, is the story needed everyone, or most everyone, in that scene, in that town, to know who the Jedi are in order to sell the Inquisitors. They didn't care about how well known they should or shouldn't be in the galaxy, how many people in that town should actually know about them. They're only trying to introduce and establish them as something to truly be afraid of, something truly terrifying and to be feared. They want them to come off as a legitimate threat that may do anything from find and kill Kenobi to stumble upon and kill or capture Luke Skywalker, though the problem is we know none of those things can actually happen, which is actually a huge problem. You're introducing villains that we know will have to fail, which is why we at least need those in the story to be afraid of them. Problem is, this is all absolutely terrible for the narrative that the Empire was trying to erase the Jedi from the minds of the people of the galaxy, which again is established in many places across the canon, and is something I agree that they would try and do, because if you were someone who didn't know about the Jedi before this day, you're certainly going to know about them after this. You're going to be curious about just who and what these dark-clad, red laser sword-wielding monsters were looking for. And what makes this all even worse or more confusing is that despite this overt display by the Inquisitors, which was probably duplicated on other worlds where they were looking for Jedi, by the time of The Mandalorian, which is some 25 years after this, and thus then 5 years after the Empire fell, which is also 5 years after Luke Skywalker was apparently starting to be so overburdened by becoming a legend across the galaxy, so much so that he felt the Jedi were being glorified and deified to the point they needed to end. Anyway, by the time of The Mandalorian, many didn't seem to know who and what the Jedi were at all anymore. Even a Mandalorian bounty hunter whose parents died in the Clone Wars, of all things, had never heard about them. Nor did Cara Dune know anything about them at all, it seems, either. She didn't even recognize Luke Skywalker when he came and rescued her and the others. You know, the same Luke Skywalker that was a figurehead of the rebellion, a symbol of hope across the galaxy, one that, again, would become a legend that he was so burdened by he couldn't stand it, not to mention the guy who blew up the first Death Star, which was the thing that blew up her home planet of Alderaan. And look, all this isn't something that honestly bothers me too much. Like I said at the top, I get into many fun debates over this one, and many other things Star Wars related for that matter, because I enjoy it, and that's something I enjoy doing here on this channel as well.
That's why I'm here.
And though I personally believe after 1,000 generations, knowledge of their existence would be far more commonplace, especially again on more populated and connected worlds in the Republic that they had been the guardians of for all that time, I think many people would have heard them almost by default, which isn't the same as seeing or believing in them. Anyway, I will absolutely acknowledge there are or would be many, many variables when it comes to how likely it is that someone, a single individual, has or hasn't heard about the Jedi. But it does still feel a bit frustrating that there seems to be no consistency here at all. 1 minute, a bunch of randoms on Tatooine know all about the Inquisitors and what they hunt. The next, a Mandalorian is clueless about his people's ancient enemy. And it all comes down to which will serve the given story better, not what actually does or doesn't make sense for the galaxy or the canon. As I was saying before, in the Kenobi series, it's simply beneficial for the story, for the people of Tatooine, to have heard of and to fear the Inquisitors to help sell them to the audience. I mean, imagine if instead of the response they got when they arrived, which was pretty much sheer terror out of everyone, they instead walk down the ramp and start walking down, again, Main Street, and people start yelling at them that they can't park there because they have no idea who they are and they don't care. And then someone even comes along and gives them a ticket, maybe even throws them in jail for illegal parking. I mean, how lame would that be, right? While in The Mandalorian, Din Djarin not knowing the first thing about the Jedi, despite being a Mandalorian and they have quite the history with the Jedi, anyway, it helps sell the air of mystery around Grogu. It works far better for the story they want to tell. It's not going to be the same if, in that first episode, Din opens up the pod, sees Grogu, and says something like, hey, this thing looks a lot like that Yoda guy I saw all the time in the holovids about the Clone Wars. The same way it'd be weird if Cara Dune totally just fangirled out when Luke Skywalker showed up and saved them, even though she should have, at the very least, wanted to shake his hand and knew who he was. And speaking of Luke, for the last Jedi to work, Luke and the Jedi needed to have become well known across the galaxy. He needed to have become a legend, one that even Rey on a backwater planet like Jakku had heard about. Then there's even Han in A New Hope. He talks about how he's been from one end of the galaxy to the other, seen a lot of strange things he can't explain, but that he doesn't believe that explanation is the Force. He doesn't say he has never heard of the Jedi. He never specifically mentions them. and I dare say Chewbacca would take issue with him making such a declaration that the Jedi aren't real, considering Chewie fought in the Clone Wars with Jedi. In closing here, it's a fun thing to debate in my opinion, and I will continue to do so, no doubt, in the comments below on this one. But the real answer is, like it all too often is, despite wanting consistency, that however well known the story needs the Jedi to be, is going to be how well known the Jedi are. It's like hyperspace being as fast or as slow as the plot requires, that sometimes it feels like it takes days to get from one place to another, and other times, like in The Rise of Skywalker, you can go back and forth across the galaxy multiple times in 16 hours. Well, that's all I got for you this time. Now it's your turn to weigh in on this one. Is this inconsistent, or are there perfect explanations for these apparent inconsistencies? Or maybe does it just not bother you at all, or that much? Is it okay for the sake of the story to twist things a little bit to have a story work better? Or should you strictly adhere to what's been established elsewhere, or what makes sense? Is there no point in a shared universe if everyone gets to frame it a little differently? Whatever you think, leave your comments below and let's talk some Star Wars. And until next time, thanks for watching.